Let's talk now about React state. Sometimes it's very confusing as to what needs to be state in a component and what doesn't need to be state. There are really three rules that help you determine something shouldn't be state. So it's not state if it's passed in via props. So as an example, if I've got some sort of a component and it's getting some props, I would not want to do something like this. Pull out from props.foo a state variable with a foo and a set foo. We don't want to do that. Why? Well, if the properties change, then the components can be re-rendered. That's how React works. Properties change, component gets re-rendered. So if the component gets re-rendered, we're going to get a new value of props.foo. So there's no particular reason to save it into a state variable. So instead, what we can do is just either use props.foo wherever we're using foo in this function, or alternatively, what we can do is just say that foo equals props.foo and then use foo. So this would be the case where it's just too much typing. You're using props.foo all over the place and you don't want to have to type those extra 6 characters. That's one case where this should not be a state variable. A second case where you don't want a state variable is doesn't change. So that's presumably the case here is we never actually used set foo. If we're never going to use set foo, there's no reason to ever have state information. Because if you're never using the set, that just means that the value is the same as what we're initially passing in to use state. There's actually a separate problem with using this use state here, because this is going to set the state based on the initial value of props.foo that comes in here. And then as we call subsequent times, it's going to ignore this value. So we're going to get a stale value of props.foo rather than getting the current value of props.foo. So for number 2, if it's not changing, if you're not using the set call, don't use state. When I say doesn't change, I really mean doesn't change in this function. You're not using the set call. If you're not using the set call, it's not changing. If something outside is changing, some parent is changing a value, then they'll just pass it to you as a new value in props. So it can be changing over time, but it's changing as a parameter coming in, as one of your properties that's coming in. And then the third case is if it be calculated from props, state, or other variables. Let's look at this calculation. A good example might be, let's say you have a list and you want to display the length of the list. So that's props.list.length. Well, this is exactly how you do it. You just go ahead and calculate this value based on an existing property. What you would not do is say something like const length set length equals use state. So this is not what you would do. And it really violates 2 rules. One, we have a value that can be calculated from properties. And so we don't put it in state. Second is because we're actually not ever changing. We're not using the set state. I hope that helps a little bit in explaining why state information is really something that's used rarely. And one good example where state information would be used is if you had, let's say, a form, and your form had a name and a checkbox. Here, the name and the checkbox are not passed in as properties. Maybe their initial values are. Instead, they're filled out by the user. Basically, that's state information that should be kept. What is the name that the user's typed so far, and what is the current value of subscriber? And so as the user types in here and changes this input field, you would update the name with set name. As they check or uncheck subscriber, you would update the Boolean in set subscriber. So that's a very common case where we'll be using state, is to manage or capture user information that they have entered into inputs.